channel. My name is Antonio Gervasoni. I'm a proven composer and university professor, and this is the first video in my series on music composition, which aims to introduce you to some key aspects of this wonderful art. In this video, I'll briefly explain some fundamental concepts about music composition. Music composition can be seen as a process whose purpose is to organize sounds according to their characteristics, height, duration, intensity, and timbre, in such a way that the resulting product acquires meaning in the context of musical art. In its simplest version, the process can be imagined as a box. In it are different techniques of transformation and organization of musical material. To start the process, at least one initial idea is required, be it of any type and degree of complexity, from a simple and short one to one of considerable length. This idea enters the box, and through different techniques, it is transformed into a more extensive and complex musical fragment, which is not only the output but also constitutes a new entry therein, thereby establishing a feedback loop. New ideas can be incorporated later, or the process can continue based on the initial idea until its potential for transformation has been completely exhausted. I said that inside the box there are different techniques of transformation and organization. What do I mean by that? Let's imagine that I'm a painter and I want to make a painting. And let's imagine that I have a very simple idea, like this one. One possible way to develop this idea would be to simply repeat it several times, changing its size and color. This is a technique. The result of this process would be perhaps something like this. Not very promising, I agree, but I'm not a painter after all. In music composition, we can use different techniques to transform our ideas. Some are simple, like repeating the idea several times with minimal variations, but others can be very complex and can sometimes be packaged into what we traditionally call a system. Any set of techniques for transforming and organizing musical material constitutes a system. The oldest one in Western music is known as the tonal system, which is still widely used in popular music, but has been largely abandoned by contemporary classical music composers, giving rise to atonality, which does not constitute a system in itself, but simply refers to the absence of tonal methods for organizing musical material. For a few decades, composers of atonal works all faced the same problem. Given the absence of a system, without a solid technique, the composition process does not provide entirely satisfactory results. It wasn't until the second decade of the 20th century that other systems began to emerge, the first of them proposed by the German composer Arnold Schoenberg, known as the 12-tone technique or dodecaphony. This system was then followed by another known as integral serialism, or simply serialism. Several other systems have followed, all of them designed and used by different composers, and even adopted by other composers as well, but none of them has reached a similar spread to that of the 12-tone technique or serialism, much less than that of the tonal system. There are also psychological aspects related to music composition. Gestalt psychology emerged in the early 20th century in Austria and Germany as a theory of perception. According to this branch of psychology, the mind configures the elements that come to it through the senses and memory through a series of laws and principles. While Gestalt psychology was primarily conceived to understand visual information, Gestalt psychologists claim that it could be also used to explain our auditory and tactile perceptions, as well as higher mental processes such as memory. Gestalt psychology is a precursor to cognitive psychology, which originated around the 1960s and which studies how people understand the world in which they live, how they take information from their senses and transform it, synthesize, elaborate, store, recover, and finally make use of it. Here are some examples of 3 Gestalt principles. The principle of proximity states that elements that are spaced apart seem less related than those placed close together. The principle of closure explains why we perceive objects as being whole even when they are not complete. The principle of continuity says that when objects intersect, we tend to perceive them as two uninterrupted entities. Gestalt principles can be applied to music. The principle of similarity, for example, explains why we perceive this melody as a single entity. The principle of continuity, on the other hand, explains why we think of this bass line as a continuous progression even when the notes are separated by rests. The figure ground principle explains why we consider a melody played by a violin with an orchestral accompaniment to be in the foreground, while the orchestra remains in the background. Now, I'm not saying that composers use these principles or any others in a direct way. Gestalt psychology and cognitive psychology were conceived to understand how the mind works, not as a set of rules to be consciously used in any human activity. The Zygonic theory of musical understanding is a new theory proposed by researcher Adam Ockelford in 1993. It maintains that imitation is the fundamental organizing force in music, and it's based on similarity relationships between elements of a musical work. We can see how this theory works in this musical example. There are primary relationships, mental connections between the qualities of the sounds themselves, for example, the interval between two notes. Secondary relationships, which link primary ones, recognizing, for example, the difference between two melodic intervals. And tertiary relationships, which link secondary ones and represent a considerable degree of abstraction. Some composers, most notably Stravinsky, have argued that music has no meaning in itself. This may be true to some extent. In fact, we cannot say that a passage from one of Mozart's symphonies means anything in the same way as a fragment from a Shakespearean sonnet. However, there are some basic attributes in music that are generally understood in a certain way. A dissonant chord in the low register, for example, can be associated, in certain contexts at least, with negative feelings, while a consonant chord in the high register will likely be associated with positive feelings. This has psychological explanations because, on the one hand, when we sing, we feel the vibrations of low notes in our chest and those of high notes in our head, hence the use of the adjectives low and high to describe them, and we culturally relate the term low with negative and high with positive. On the other hand, consonance and dissonance, although they are cultural values for the most part, are also associated with positive and negative ideas, respectively. There are also clichés, short musical ideas that are part of our Western culture, such as the rhythm of Chopin's funeral march to signify death, or the melody of Brahms' lullaby to represent childhood. Therefore, music is not without meaning at all. Just ask film composers how they make a living, and they'll all tell you that it's thanks to different musical codes that they use to communicate very specific ideas. But this happens because there is a visual action that clarifies what the music is trying to communicate. Without it, music is truly devoid of all meaning. The word flower, for example, has no meaning in itself. It wouldn't make any sense to, say, an alien. Its meaning is derived from the culture in which it is used. It's a kind of code. It means something because we associate it with a very specific type of thing, and the same can be said of musical sounds, although their meaning, of course, is much more vague and can change from one person to another. Yet at least they mean something to each and every one of us, even if we can't agree on what. Despite all that I've said, The truth is that composing music, at least on a basic level, doesn't require knowing anything about techniques, musical systems, psychological aspects of human perception, or musical codes. Many composers write music following nothing more than their own intuition. They are guided by a kind of instinct for what should come next in order to stay consistent with what was previously presented. I do this myself most of the time. On the other hand, just knowing all these things will not be sufficient for anyone to become a composer. However, it is true that some techniques, such as serialism, will allow anyone without intuition but sufficient musical knowledge to write compelling musical works. What all of these concepts are useful for is to understand why things work most of the time and what kind of action to take when they occasionally don't. Thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to be notified when I post a new one. I give private lessons online on composition. If you want to know more, click on the linked video or visit my website. The link is in the description below.